afternoon and welcome to the May 24th, 2023 City Council work session. Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format. For work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment, those wishing to access the meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials web page. And I thank you again for joining us. And I am going to call this meeting to order, but just take a moment to recognize that this week, May 21st to 27, is National Emergency Medical Services Week. It is the 48th year of this national recognition. The Emergency Medical Services Week highlights the dedicated individuals committed to providing quality emergency medical care to their community 24 hours per day, 7 days per week. EMS teams engage in thousands of hours of specialized training and continuing education to enhance their life-saving skills. EMS Week serves as a reminder of the incredible contributions of our EMS providers make each day, saving lives and ensuring the welfare of our community. Their ability to remain calm under pressure, combined with their skills and knowledge, undoubtedly contributes to the positive outcomes of many critical situations. And so we take a moment to really thank our EMS providers here in the city of Eugene and in Lane County. So thank you for that moment. And with that, I will turn to the city manager for the first item of business, the prohibited camping.
Thank you, Mayor. And for this first item, I'm actually going to turn it over to our city attorney.
Hi, good afternoon. So this is your fourth work session on this topic, and today is your opportunity to discuss and hopefully take action on the ordinance that was the subject of the public hearing on May 15th. The ordinance that is in your packet as attachment A includes the results of those discussions that you had over the last work sessions. It's based and structured on that outline that was provided to you originally back in March. And then the ordinance includes the motion that you unanimously passed in April that included a number of different changes that you sought to have made to the ordinance. It includes that. And then most recently, and then the final change and only change that was made to the ordinance that was the subject of the public hearing is the clarification around the definition of the educational facility to include preschools, licensed preschools. And the other pieces that were identified and set out in your motion are in there, and I'm happy to point them out where they're if folks have questions or how they ended up kind of being articulated in the ordinance. But that I didn't plan on diving deep in it. We've had this discussion a lot. I'm here for questions. You have Matt, and Christy is also here to answer questions as well. But this is your opportunity to talk and make some decisions.
Thank you. So are there counselors who have comments or questions on this item? Have Alan, take it away.
I had a question. I saw on the news the other night. Was it Grants Pass? Some city south of here just did a camping ban, and they were ticking off how they did it. Are you familiar with this? And it just seemed to me like that's not going to come close to pass muster. They basically just banned camping everywhere, which I think is going to be contrary to what the bill was trying to do.
It's so there definitely have been, as part of coming up with that original set of recommendations for all of you, I did do a fairly extensive look at the various ways cities are grappling with this around the city. And there are some that are very broad. And there are others that are more limited. I think the one you may be speaking about, I don't know what was reported on, was potentially the Roseburg ordinance. Yeah, I think that was the most recently passed. Yes. Ultimately, the likelihood is that this will get worked out in the courts. Some ordinance will end up kind of being the test one, and we'll get the benefits of that in seeing what they say. And so it's possible some court decisions may ultimately result in us coming back and having another discussion as well. But having an ordinance that very specifically is intended to address three very clear things: safety, accessibility, and public health. And having very clear reasoning around it, I think is structured and appropriate and responsive to the bill.
Yeah, I appreciate our approach to this and your approach to this with those three different things. As opposed to a blanket one that basically just tries to push against or go beyond over the line in terms of what's acceptable and then wait for it to be nailed down in the courts. I think it serves us better to have one that's workable. And I think what we've done here and the ads that we have done actually make this much more workable. I know there's some still things in here like how far is 100 feet and from where and all those things, but that's not something new. We've been doing that for actually in other parts of the code for literally decades. So it's not a new thing, but it's applied in a new area. So I appreciate the structure and the approach that we've taken. I think it's probably appropriate.
Okay, thank you. Emily and then Randy.
Thank you. I'm concerned about the parking strips and also sidewalks and shared paths. On the parking strip, can the owners still trespass as they have been able to before?
Yes, they have. That provision is in a separate code related to their responsibility to maintain it vegetatively. And those are for vegetative ones. And that's not being amended as part of this.
And is there this was brought up to my attention, if campers are sleeping on top of your tomatoes, is there anything you can do? I guess then you would be an owner who would trespass.
Tomatoes planted in the parking.
Yeah,
strip.
whatever people are doing in the parking
Yeah.
strip, rocks, grass, bark mulch, tomatoes, rose bushes. My parking strip is heavily planted with flowers and miscellaneous. And I wouldn't be really happy if somebody camped on top of it. So,
And that was the discussion and reasoning around I think it was 5 years ago when those code provisions were put in place, which the abutting property owner is responsible for maintaining that, and people put in money and plants and stuff. And so if in fact it's being used in a way that's contrary to that, someone sleeping in it, that is where that authority comes in to be able to trespass somebody else.
okay. I'm also concerned about camping on sidewalks. It sounds like as long as the sidewalk is more than 4 feet, you can camp on it. So if it was 10 feet, you could camp on that side, or as long as there was still 5 feet to the street. And I noticed people camping on the planting strip and are often also on the sidewalk. So I think that could be a dangerous thing. And it also comes into the accessibility for ADA. 4 feet is really not that much. And it's hard to have people pass, especially if one is on wheels. And then also the shared path. If the path is, 10 feet for that? After that, I guess you can camp on it, but then I could run into you with my bicycle. So I'm concerned, not that I want to keep people from having a place to sleep, but I'm concerned about taking over sidewalks and paths that we already have designated for everybody to use. And one of the problems is when a certain group of people take over something and the rest of the population can't use it. So I have some reservations about that. I'd like to see actually no camping on sidewalks or paths and a buffer zone. I don't know if that's possible or what other people think about it. But those are my concerns: safety, accessibility. A lot of safety issues there for me. That's it.
Okay.
And I could also add that with some of these, we had a very specific goal in mind, like accessibility. And so we looked at what would be the reasonable width and to put in this ordinance, with the understanding that if in fact accessibility is still not being achieved, you can come back and look at that. But it would give you having these specific provisions in here will give you something to work from if in fact you're like 4 feet ultimately didn't end up being enough. And then you could go wider instead of starting wide and trying to justify the wider width. That was my approach. That was our approach.
So as long as you're 5 feet from the curb, you can be right up against the sidewalk.
If there's kind of two provisions that are working together. It's 5 feet from the travel lane and then a minimum of 4 feet of sidewalk width. So in those areas where you have 5 feet and then you have, and I don't know how big a typical tent would be, 3 feet.
But
I
no,
don't know how big they are.
5 feet.
They would have to be, that would have to be a fairly wide space to accommodate that. And so if it's a fairly wide space to accommodate that, it's probably also wide enough to allow for that, for the passage of that accessibility, because you're talking about actually a fairly big space.
But it could be right up against the sidewalk.
It could be. It could be.
I think that's really crowding things for both the campers and the people on the sidewalk. So I just have concerns about that. There, a lot of houses have planting strips and it can get really crowded. And then people don't want to use the sidewalk because they're walking through someone's bedroom. Those are my ideas.
Okay, thank you. Randy and then Jennifer.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, staff, for putting this together. I think you really heard what we were saying and what our concerns were. In addressing what Emily said, I see this as kind of a jumping off point, and I imagine we are going to have to make adjustments. I too am concerned about our sidewalks. And to me, it's more than just the tents, it's the possessions and the inevitable debris field that seems to always develop or generally develop that we need to be concerned about. But I think this is a good starting point of trying to protect some of our most vulnerable areas, including our waterways from an environmental standpoint and public use standpoint. And then also trying to make sure we keep clear areas around our educational facilities, which are also part of our most vulnerable members of our community. So I think this is in line. I feel good about it. I intend to support it. I did want to address one thing. We've heard some comments. Some people did not like jumping from the $250 fine to the $500 fine and have raised valid points. If somebody can't afford $250, they can't afford $500. I see that a little differently. I think what we're doing is saying, we're serious about this. This is important. And at the end of the day, it's up to our presiding municipal court judge or the judge that's hearing the case. It's going to decide exactly what the corrective action is. And I've had some conversations with Judge Gill, and I know he's committed to looking to alternative sentences, corrective actions, whatever you want to call it, that's based on work and work crews. So I think we have options other than imposing a monetary fine that still enforces the use. We do have certain elements in our community that just repeatedly violate the law. And I know I had some neighbors who are very concerned that with some RVs and trailers in West Eugene. And I went and looked, and it's some of the same ones we see repeatedly, and there's already debris fields going on. So I want to recognize too that members of our public are very sensitized to this. So we are trying to find a balance, and I'm speaking to the community now. We are trying to find a balance between compassion, but also that accountability, responsibility, and consequences. And that's kind of a line that moves around a little bit. It's different for each offender, but it's something that I think we need to take seriously. I know I hear almost daily about just different issues that pertain to this, as I'm sure many of you do. And we need to signal that we are serious about correcting this issue. Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer and then Lindsay.
Thank you. So I'm wondering what do you think the legislature wrote this House bill with the primary intention of supporting unhoused residents or housed residents?
The stated, but I can't speak to it.
Right. I mean, your interpretation, right? They're
This-
not here to.
The stated purpose was, and it was referred to as codification of Boise. The stated purpose was to take the two decisions that came out of Boise and then also the Grants Pass case and codify those. That's was the stated intent of it.
Okay. I guess what I'm struggling with is that if our intention, I think this is very good. I think we're doing, I think like what Randy is saying, this is difficult and we're doing the best we can. I like the identified priorities that we've been talking about, but a lot of the discussion feels like we're talking about supporting folks who are housed and not so much of talking about the other side of this, which is a little uncomfortable for me. I agree that the fines are completely ineffective. Raising the fines is just going to mean someone has a harder time when they get to that point to move on into a different situation in their lives, that they will just have a higher set of fines to deal with at that point. So I'm not super supportive of that, although it would not by itself keep me from supporting this. I do agree with Emily. I think our paths and our sidewalks are part of our transportation system, and having folks in our transportation system that are not using it as it is intended is not the best use of that system. If that was something we were going to adjust, I would support it either now or in the future after we get more information about how it is happening in how our decisions are working in the real world. And lastly, this is probably not super popular, but I also think that having some way for folks to know where it is okay to be would go a long ways in making this effort about folks who are unhoused as well as those of us who are housed. I realize that is a hard thing to do, but it feels like there might be part of some kind of mapping that we could do to help people understand where it is that they can be and where it is that they can't be. And that is all.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to reiterate just kind of that intent of the law and what we're trying to achieve here. And I think we're only really going to keep perpetuating this cycle of criminalizing being unhoused without that second piece of where are they allowed to be. And if we don't have that, it's just going to be fining, paying for enforcement, the court system, our EMTs, our behavioral health. It is far, far cheaper to house people in case study after case study after case study across the entire United States. It's cheaper to get people housing or get people a place than it is to continue to perpetuate that cycle. People are just going to continue to fail if they're getting fined and jailed for the simple act of being unhoused. And this willful violation is just 2 times in 1 month. We cannot house people in 30 days in this community. And so if we can, Bend did publish a map that has permitted and prohibited camping outlined. I know that we're not Bend, we're Eugene, so we need to come up with a system that is fitting for our city and our system. But I don't think I can support this moving forward without some kind of assurance that we're going to designate areas where people can be that are adequate so that if we find someone who is unhoused, who is not in the right place, that we can get them to a place that they can legally be, and so that we can get them services from the community. So I also agree with the $500 fee. Yes, can we come up with a different system of community service or some way to reduce that burden? People are likely not paying that. We're not going to be receiving that money over time, and they can't get jobs if they're going to keep getting arrested for this. So I'm happy to keep talking about what that might look like. That's where I stand at the moment.
Hey, thank you. I have a couple of counselors in the queue for a second round, but I actually want to sort of jump in on this, and a couple of things. Just a reminder that this is not the only work council is doing related to housing. providing services for the unhoused. And that this is a specific piece of work focused on a specific piece of legislation that requires us to be in compliance. You also have a very large body of work and a huge city investment in providing alternatives. So both things can exist. They're not in conflict with each other. You are doing both of those things, and I don't know that this sort of legal requirement that we have in responding to to this House, to this state legislation is the appropriate vehicle for us to also be addressing homelessness. We have a process for doing that, and council has many opportunities to weigh in on that. So just, there's an appropriate sort of place and process for each of those. And I'm not sure this is the piece of the ordinance, the code changes that have to embody that. But I think we all share that concern. And I commented last time in this meeting that this council has approved 500 safe sleep sites. We've only been able to afford in 250 of them. We would love to have the other 250. And there's a lot of work going on at the state level as well to try and fund that work. And what I'm understanding about our intent around the increased fine is we are trying to push willful violators to go to community court. So we're not trying to create more of a crisis for them. We're actually trying to compel them to actually seek the services, have that fine forgiven in exchange for doing alternative service and other things. So I think, again, cognizant of that the intent is not to raise the penalty on someone who can't pay, but to actually particularly look at willful violations and how you kind of push people to helping to work for solutions. And the other thing is I am interested in the sidewalk piece, and I read some of that testimony of people concerned about their sidewalks. And I guess it's the width piece. I mean, the average sidewalk is how wide, the average right of way is how wide. I mean, how much space do we normally have to work with in that? And maybe you could address that, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So it does vary, especially right away widths, but sidewalks outside of the downtown core, and when we have something that's called a wide side path, like in front of Autzen Stadium that people kind of use as shared use path, sidewalks typically 5 feet. Our shared use path system, it really depends on where you are. It probably varies anywhere from 8 feet to most typically 12. And then there are a couple places where it might be a little bit wider than that as well. That's typically what you have. For landscape setbacks, again, that varies. It can be none when you have a curbside sidewalk. We have some streets where it's probably very few, but a few where it might be closer to 10 or 12 feet. On average, it's probably closer to 5 or 6.
Okay, well, that helps just sort of keep the dimensions in mind. It does seem like something that we might want to watch and consider whether we need a revision, because I could see some in a lot of cases that would feel pretty crowded if someone has a tent in a space that's 5 feet wide. So, and with a 5-foot sidewalk. Okay, thank you. So with that, I'll turn back to Alan and then Emily for second rounds.
Yeah, our focus of this ordinance, I think, is appropriate on public health, safety, and accessibility. I totally get the need that we need more sites. Nobody but counselors understands how difficult that is more than anybody in the city. It's extremely difficult to site these things. It's extremely difficult to fund them, fund their operations. And let us not forget the lessons learned from Occupy and the Washington Jefferson, which is just going to open next week after $1 million of remediation. But also the lesson learned from that was too many people in a single space turns out really, really badly. I mean, when we had that was organized when we did that. The Occupy one, when it wasn't organized, we ended up with a lot of predators going into those vulnerable camps and preying on those people, which was despicable. And if you recall, in the end, we ended up with a murder. And that's when we shut it down. And so the lesson learned for me was you cannot have a free-for-all. You have to have it structured. You have to have it, the number of people confined, and you need to have bathrooms, and garbage and supervision or governance associated with. So that's what we're trying to do with these things, but it's very difficult to do. And we're doing the best we can, and we need to do about 10 or 15 more sites, but we don't even have that many on our horizon. So, and it's not a free for all. In front of my house, I think it's about 4 feet is the sidewalk in my neighborhood. And what the rule says, you must have a minimum clear path of 4 feet. If your sidewalk's 4 or 5 feet, that means you can't camp on the sidewalk. So no sidewalks are actually going to have tents on them because there's not enough space to get by. I mean, think of someone in a wheelchair or in walking crutches. How are they going to get by you if you're in the middle of the sidewalk? So that's the purpose of this. So effectively what we've done is on most sidewalks, not allowed people to camp. Same with the paths, which is 10 feet. You still need 10 feet. So, and you still can't block entrances and exits and ramps and things like that. So there's lots of places that you cannot do this. If you're in the right of way though, it's not as simple as it seems. You still need to have a letter of trespass filed with EPD. I tried to go on the website and find how to do that. I couldn't do it. So I have people actually call EPD, which is probably not the best way to do it. Is there some way maybe we can elevate that, make it simpler for people to access that so they can get their letter of trespass? Without a letter of trespass, the cops can't come and get the people off your tomatoes. And then finally, the $500.
You might need a third round.
Okay.
Okay, Emily and then Randy.
Thank you. Alan, I'm going to take some exception to your conclusions about the occupied camp since I was there. Police were bringing homeless to the camp. It did get out of control, but not because of the people doing the Occupy protests.
No, it was the predators.
Somebody did die, but there was a person who was dropped off drunk with more alcohol, got into a fight, went to the hospital and did die, but I would not call it a murder. So I think that we're possibly exaggerating what happened there. The $500 fine, I don't think it's going to help at all, because if you don't have any money, what difference does it make? And the higher it gets, I think you might be less inclined to go to community court because the punishment might be even stricter. So I'm concerned about that. We keep hearing the solution is get people housed. Cool. But we don't have enough houses for people who can afford houses. So that's really frustrating. I do not think we want to publish a map. It would be opening the door to a lot of problems. However, I'm also concerned about where you can camp, because are people going to look for the really wide planting strips? How many feet past the water restriction is allowed? Do you do up till you get to a street or to a park or a school? So I'm really concerned about what's left. I suggest everyone go to the dollar store and get a tape measure. I just see this as a problem. At the river, you camp above the high water mark. How far before you're at the Campbell Center, and what's the restriction there? Even if we don't make a map, I do think people will do this research, which could result in a non-official map. I think that there need to be restrictions for everyone to be protected, but I am concerned that what's left and what will be the effect in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interject. I want to correct something that I said earlier that Matt was able to find, and it addresses your question about the trespass letter, Councilor Zelenka. So on the website, it speaks specifically to the provision around managing the vegetative planting strip. And it says, for residential properties, a trespass letter is not required to file a trespassing complaint It is only required that either the owner or tenant ask the person to leave the premises and they fail to do so, or they tell the person to not enter the property and they do so. The owner or tenant should be willing to act as the complainant by contacting EPD non-emergency. And there is a separate process that can be used, but it's not the trespass letter but there is, the standard trespassing, you're not allowed to be here. They don't leave. And then you proceed from there. So and I can provide some follow-up as well, specific to, because we worked through kind of all those details when it was a apartment complex. So it was more of a business and those things for the planting strip.
Clarify.
So
Yeah.
just to maybe clarify that again, it's for a business or commercial property, you do need a trespass letter. For residential properties, you do not.
Oh, okay. That's
Make that really clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. I have a point I want to make, but first I want to make sure that we're clear on something. It's not 100 feet from the high water mark. It's 100 feet from the point of high bank, where the high bank begins. Second, I agree with Councilor Zelenka. I was around when we had the Occupy Eugene, and it was a train wreck. The unsupervised, and what I try to communicate to constituents that say, just find a field somewhere. It needs more than that. If you don't regulate it, if you don't manage it, it turns into a complete dangerous mess. And then the point I wanted to make for the second round was, I'm personally not in favor of anybody residing in the parking strips. Vehicles jump curbs, and when they jump curbs and there's a person there, the person loses every time. I see it as a safety issue. I've actually seen the aftermath a number of times of where cars jump the curbs, more frequently at corners, but it happens sometimes mid-block too. And again, it is not a good outcome. It is not a safe place to reside. It's not a safe place to be. So I'm hoping at some point we can figure out how to come back to that from a safety standpoint of actually protecting the most vulnerable. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. And Alan, I know you needed a third round.
Yeah, so clarifying, if you're a resident, your home, someone's in your right of way, you don't need a letter of trespass. You just need to tell them, you're trespassing on my property, please leave. If they don't leave, you can call EPD, not 911, the EPD, and they can respond and have them move on. But if you are a commercial entity, you can have, you need a letter of trespass for EPD to enforce that trespass.
I'm looking over at Chief because I don't want to say the wrong thing and have him be like,
So this has been confusing for a while.
So thank you for the question. So the real crux of this is being able to fulfill the elements of trespass, the crime of trespass. There's a first and second degree trespass, the elements of the crime of trespass. What it allows for is a reasonable amount of time to leave once told that you have to leave. And generally speaking, the person that has to do that is a person that's in control of the property or presides over the property. So residential situations usually means a homeowner is coming out and saying, hey, please leave. This is my private property. I'm asking you to leave. Please leave. Reasonable amount of time for that person to leave. And if they don't, then they call EPD, and then we're able to go out and enforce the trespass. The trespass letter for us often fits nicely because many of the people that own commercial property don't actually reside on the property. And so it gives us that authority remotely to be able to come in and tell them to leave. And we would do the same thing in most instances. We would show up and say, we've got a letter of trespass on file. We're asking you to leave on behalf of the property owner. And then if they choose to leave, then that's a great outcome for us. And in the event that they choose not to leave, then we have enforcement capabilities. So really it's about trying to meet the intent of the statute around trespass so that if we're going to make that custodial arrest or a citation in lieu of arrest, that we have met that burden of proof before it goes to court or we take somebody to jail for the trespass.
Yeah, and most of the time you just ask them to move on.
Most of the time
Almost
they
always.
comply. We don't
Yeah.
make very many arrests and or write citations for trespass
Right. That's
compared to
very,
the
very
number of instances that we're having these conversations. So
Right.
I don't want you to think that we never do that, but compared
Yes,
to the number.
I
of
know it's
instances,
rare, though.
It's
And-
very low.
The confusion comes on rental properties. They're commercial properties for the owner. And so how does that work if it's a rental property and the person living there isn't the owner?
Yeah, I think what we would suggest is the property owner usually delegates that authority to who's renting the property. And so it really is a little bit of a gray area. You can have a letter of trespass on file. The thing that's really interesting about letters of trespass is it doesn't necessarily mean that once you have a letter of trespass on file, you do nothing. You just get to step back and hope that the police drive by, recognize that's a place where you have a letter of trespass on file. They jump out of their car and they handle it for you. We still need the action of the property owner to say, you know what, I've got a letter of trespass on file. We have an issue here. I'd like you to swing out there and deal with this issue. So that's the misnomer of this letter of trespass, is they think that it just gives us a license to just go and look for all of these violations and then just haphazardly enforce them. We still like to have some owner buy-in when we're thinking about engaging somebody that could potentially be taken into custody.
Right, they have to act. You don't have a
Sure.
map of all the letters of
No.
trespass. So that's clearer. Thanks. On the $500 thing, that only applies to willful violators, right? People who refuse to leave or keep doing it. And it's an increase. So it's not everybody, it's just the willful violators. And my expectation is homeless people have no money and they can't pay that anyway. They can't pay $250 or $500. It doesn't make much difference. But to me, what that says is that it changes the way that the judge actually looks at this, that it goes from just a normal violation to a willful violation by signifying it by this $500. Not that they're going to pay the $500, but the judge then in the alternative sentencing in the community court will take that into consideration and may use that to increase the alternative sentencing mechanism to be different than a normal circumstance. That fits, right?
Right, it's definitely the willful versus just a straight up, the prohibited camping of the standard citation is a violation only, fine only, maximum $250.
Right.
It's the willful that then triggers the ability to impose the greater penalties on it.
Right. So this is signaling to the court and to the judge that this is different. And I think that's appropriate for willful. And I don't imagine we're going to see a lot of willful. Like the chief said, most people move on.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Emily, did you want another round?
Yes, please. I'm concerned about the enforcement capabilities since our officers are already not able to get around. And since we are further limiting or increasing the places where you might need enforcement, that could be an effect on that. Not to do with today's vote, but for the public, I want to say that this is about camping. It's not about sleeping. And it's taken out that a campsite is any bedding or sleeping bag. So just so people know, if you just lie down and sleep, does that mean you can't lie down and sleep in these same places? Because this is about camping. Is there an answer for that?
So the prohibited camping provisions are about the establishment of a campsite, which has this ordinance would change that definition to eliminate sleeping bag and those things. And so for the prohibited camping provisions that are specific to sidewalks, all of those, the 5 feet of those all apply to establishment of a campsite, which is a structure.
So if you were just sleeping, you could be in those places until someone trespasses.
Correct, but there are some things that do work together that make that a little bit challenging with just a yes or no. So the discussion we just had about the planting strip, that person could be trespassed for sleeping there under another provision. And then similarly, they have, if somebody is, not providing, if they're blocking the sidewalk or blocking and they're just sleeping, there's not tent, there's other provisions that may apply there. But generically speaking, our prohibited camping provisions are being further the definition of an established campsite is being further clarified that it applies to tents, establishment of a structure, not just lying down and sleeping.
I would like in the future to get information about where the sleeping is violating an ordinance. You said there were other provisions to deal with.
Well,
sleeping.
Well, there's not a single provision in our city code that references sleeping. I use the example of the planting strip. If somebody was lying on your tomato plants and they wouldn't leave after you asked them to leave, then they could be subject to trespass. Trespass doesn't mention the word sleeping, but they are in there and they are not leaving and you've asked them to leave and you're the owner. So that's how it could apply. There is not a provision in our code that relates to sleeping. And it was one of the reasons why that inclusion of a reference to a sleeping bag or materials to say what is an established campsite was confusing. So it is one of the reasons why that is being clearly deleted, because our code does not regulate sleeping and never has.
I appreciate that. Other than the private property, if you were next to the Amazon channel and it's just sleeping, would that be okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Are we, oh, Jennifer, you
Yeah.
want another round?
Real quick, so it is my understanding that the fines do create a barrier as people are moving on to more stable positions in their lives. However, if, you know, the mayor explained some of the intention behind it. So I'm wondering if there would be a way for us to get back, I mean, it doesn't need to be a work session, but get back some information on how the higher fine is affecting people in a year or so. Maybe that's something we could ask the HRC to look into, or, you know, service providers, you know.
I think community court does reports as well as the municipal court, and you speak with him yearly. I think those would be something that prior to that work session would be great coming from
Okay.
that group. I know that community court is part of their grant funding and ongoing track a lot of that stuff.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, just so that we can have a check-in to see,
Mhm.
are things occurring as we expected, right? Or have we created a problem we need to address? Okay, that is fantastic. My other question is, what is the reason we wouldn't want to prohibit camping on any size sidewalk or path?
I can say just generally the goal with when the original provisions were being drafted and Matt and I spoke, we were looking at what the minimums were that were required to achieve the goal of accessibility.
Mhm.
So, and it wasn't intended to go beyond that. They were attempted to be narrow to address very specific goals, being accessibility, and 4 feet would get us there.
Right.
So that's why it's proposed that way.
Because one of our other ones is safety. And it seems like having structures or a tent on a path or a sidewalk is not super safe for people in general. I mean, I just imagine a bike going by and, you know, someone might start to get out of there. It just seems like we're creating an unsafe transportation system, I guess is what I'm saying. And I have a lot of concerns about that, to be honest. So, all right. But I appreciate that you guys have given this a lot of thought.
Okay, thank you. I think if that is all, oh, I see Mike. It's all yours, Mike.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with Councilor Groves that vehicles not staying in the travel lane is by necessity, by definition, an acute safety hazard to those camping in planting strips at all. And I just wondered if there was, in the analysis of this, were any of our Vision Zero goals considered? Because I know we do a lot of Vision Zero work in transportation planning. And so to tag on to Jennifer's question, was this considered from a Vision Zero perspective that it's wiser just to create a prohibited camping at all, anywhere in median strips? and I guess I'm asking Catherine Brotherton on this one, I guess, or Matt.
I was looking at Matt. I will say, I mean, we did talk about all of these things. Just from a drafting standpoint, it became challenging if we weren't being specific to the number of feet. Once you start with the words all, it starts to be less of narrowing down our current definition of prohibited camping, which is all public property, including all. So starting from the standpoint that we were trying not to use the word, I was trying not to use the word all anymore. Like, what would accomplish our goals?
Well, from my perspective, I wonder, without using the word all, why wouldn't we say in keeping with our Vision Zero goals, camping in the median is prohibited?
Generally speaking, the 5 feet was based on the notion that either that most medians, if they're bigger than 5 feet and that they could accommodate a tent, they're actually going to be very big. And so could there be necessarily a 1-to-1? Like if it's a really, really big median and you have a tent in the middle of it, is there an immediate safety issue there? I would have a harder time articulating that than if the median is 7 feet and there's not going to be able to be a tent there because there's no 2-foot tent. And so you would have that 5 feet would cover most of the medians, except for the really, really large ones. And those were the ones that would be more of a struggle to articulate that immediate safety issue.
If I wanted, and I suppose I'm going to widen this to Matt and to Sarah, if I wanted to have an analysis done as to what constitutes safe in terms of distance from a travel lane, with primarily our Vision Zero goals in mind, what body, what staff person, who would do that work?
Hey, Councilor Clark, I think that would be our traffic engineer and his staff that would work on that. There are standards for, clear zones when you're designing streets and things like that could be applied to look at what type of offset you'd want from a travel lane. I think, as Catherine said, with what we presented to you in the analysis, it really was trying to get to the minimum. Council obviously has the option to choose something different.
Well, and that's, forgive me, sir, that's why I'm asking the question.
Yeah.
I want to continue. Sorry, I've been losing my voice. I want to continue on the goal of safety. Mm-hmm. And I'm applying a standard that's just pulled out of the air, as it were, and already admitted as a minimum, where if we're dealing with safety, I want to do what is the most intelligent based on what we know. And so I'm just trying to quantify how to know that so that we can create ordinance that matches up with safety, which is obviously our Vision Zero goal.
So yeah, just to repeat, there is some analysis that's standardized that we could do that would probably inform offsets. It would be based on, very specific to an individual street based on the speed that it's posted at and what the kind of curbside conditions are. It would take time, but that's something that could be done.
And I don't want to impose a request for information that takes so darn much time that's just kind of silly. There's intuitive parts of this as well, but I want to find a data-driven standard by which we further the work of increasing safety on our streets. So I'd be happy to have both the data that you have easily at hand and any suggestion about how to get more, so that we as council can make a data-driven decision about public safety. And again, I want to be mindful not to exceed a 2-hour request. I'm just looking for, if you could advise, how would a counselor best move forward with a request like that?
Councilor Clark, I think I'm struggling to understand exactly what you're trying to accomplish. So the numbers we've given you are somewhat data driven, but not exactly what you're looking for. And what the part I'm looking for clarity on is, right now you're set up, council is set up to be able to act on this ordinance today or at any point in the future, are you asking us to provide that information in order to modify this before you vote on it? Or is this something you want to track going forward?
The first, the first thing you said is what I would prefer to do, but it's not what I'm going to do today. Today, I'm going to vote in favor of the ordinance as written, but I still want that information because in the realm we're talking about of adjusting as we move forward, I want that to be a factor.
Well, if I'll just jump in, this council has, we've had several comments about the width of the sidewalk. And so it sounds like we're leading in a direction where we're going to come back and look at how well this is working. And so that seems like an opportunity, Mike, for your questions also to get some more information. Okay.
And I thank Councilor Groves for bringing that up in the first place.
All right. And I have Lindsay for one more, and then I think we're ready for a vote.
Yeah, I just want to push back just a little bit on an idea of that this isn't the appropriate place to talk about how to improve a system that most of our community perceives as broken. People from all sides of the political spectrum have kind of talked about what they want to see and somehow have all seemed to come up with a similar idea of making sure we have places for people to be. And so that's why I kind of came in strong with that. And I want to come in also and really recognize that Ward 7 bears so much significant portion of the brunt of this issue. And the residents are exhausted. The businesses are fleeing. I mean, they're tired of having to deal with the ramifications of these things. And so I do think it's appropriate to say, I don't think that this is good enough. I think this is our opportunity and that we're going to fail in a lot of ways to achieve the balance that Councilor Groves has said that he wants to achieve. We all do. It's a frustrating situation for all of us in our whole city. I've talked to thousands of people in the last 5 months in my ward, and everyone is saying the same thing. This is the #1 priority. So if we have an opportunity to talk about it, to make a difference, then we should take that. And I don't see anything else on the calendar for us in the next several months to be able to do that. And so if there's another time that we're able to come back to the table and say, what more can we do? How can we, once we get to the budget process, what can we do? And in the revenue committee, I'd really like to be able to take that opportunity. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. And with that, I think Councilor Groves, we're ready for a motion.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to adopt an ordinance concerning prohibited camping, permitted overnight sleeping, and prohibited, I'm going to start over. Just can't wrestle that one back. Sorry about that. I move to adopt an ordinance concerning prohibited camping, permitted overnight sleeping, and prohibited activities on streets, sidewalks, and shared use paths, and amending sections 4.815, 4.816, 4.860, 4.990, and 5.135 of the Eugene Code 1971 as set forth in attachment A to this AIS.
Second.
Okay, any further comments or questions? All in favor, please raise your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Opposed, 2. And that passes 6-2. Thank you very much. Thanks for the work on this and for the thoughtful conversation. And
Point of clarification, Mayor, I couldn't see who were the no votes.
The no votes were Emily and Lindsay.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a minute for a transition and then we'll turn this over to the city manager for the second item.
Thank you. Oh, wow, that was quick. So our next item actually ties nicely into the last comment Councilor Leach made about what more can we do? And I've heard that question a lot. We've been talking about potential revenue sources around this topic and others. We've also heard the conversation of, is this ours to do? And what are we not doing to do this work? And so today I think I'm going to, Twyla's going to lead us in a conversation. I see this as an entry into a conversation about kind of where we're heading around our services and revenues. With that, I'll hand it to Twyla and we'll look forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you.
Good afternoon, Mayor and Councilors. I'm Twyla Miller, the Chief Financial Officer. And I was here in April with this conversation, and I really wanted to think back to this conversation first actually came to council about revenues back in December of 2021. Councilor Zelenka asked for a work session to discuss funding for homelessness and climate issues. So since that time, many things have changed and revenue needs across many services have increased over time. And you've been hearing about many affected areas recently and as part of the budget conversations, including fire, library, and animal services, but really services across our organization are in great need. So today, as Sarah mentioned, it's an opportunity to begin a discussion about which services should be considered as part of the scope for the Revenue Committee, or maybe those things should we continue to do or not continue to do. So just to touch a bit back on the budget. So as we've looked to the budget, building the budget, we did have a gap. So we have a structural gap in our general fund. So our general fund revenues, which are primarily property taxes, are growing at a much slower pace than our expenditure loads. So we have the $15 million structural gap. And then over time, our organization has been investing on one-time basis on many urgent and emerging needs in our community, including downtown and unhoused efforts. And so we identified an additional need of about $5 million as we look to a biennium for the gap as we look to the future to fund some of those needs. As part of this budget, we have considered revenues. So as we were building things again, things continue to change and needs continue to grow. So in the second year of the biennium, even though we have addressed many of these issues through the budget strategies in the proposed budget, there is an $8 million revenue need identified in FY25, so the second year of the biennium. So that's again $8.3 million that supports the existing service system that's proposed in the budget. Additionally, as part of those pieces, there's an additional $5 million for unhoused services. So the proposal includes continuing unhoused services in the biennium, but there is an additional $5 million gap if we're going to continue that level of service through the biennium. When we talk about revenues, I know city managers talked about big R and little r. So when we think about big R, those are those things that are really policy decisions. So they take more time to implement and they take action by council. So it might be something like implementing a new tax or a bond or a levy where it actually takes council action and policy direction to implement. And then there's also little r. So those are those revenues that are more administrative in nature. There are quite a few of those in the current budget. So we have some fee increases across many departments. In finance, we're implementing an e-payable solution to increase our rebate. And then also we will be working with EPUD to increase to implement a franchise fee. The other piece we're looking at as we look at the budget is really those solutions to identify the gaps. So those identified gaps of 15 million and 5 million. So as we think about the structural gap, there are quite a few pieces solutions we've identified in the proposed budget. They involve personnel, materials and services, many efficiencies across the service system and the organization. And then as we thought about those urgent needs of the community, really taking a look at our services, and even though we value all of our services, really repurposing some of those services to continue our investment on an ongoing basis for some of these areas such as unhoused, downtown, and alternative response. So this is just a reminder of we're in a period of change. We have a lot going on. We're implementing biennial budgeting. As we've looked as an organization to identify these gaps, we've implemented PBB, or priority-based budgeting, and looking at our programs that we serve both internally and externally to the organization. The organization conducted a community survey last summer, which was very informative. And also the council has engaged in strategic planning efforts last fall, which have continued. So as we think about the community survey, and strategic planning and how those pieces tie together with some of the needs of the community, I just wanted to touch today on a few pieces that CMO staff brought back to council when they discussed the survey with you in September. So this slide here is showing of the survey respondents, what is the most important action the city of Eugene could take? And you can see the top ones there are homelessness, housing, crime safety, and cleanliness. And looking just forward for 1 year, over the next year, you can see the top respondent responses were homelessness, illegal public activity and public safety, and housing, which are very similar when people are thinking out. So when they're looking to the future and looking to the next 3 to 5 years, again, homelessness, housing, public safety, and climate were the top 4 overall. And then this slide really is interesting because it really shows the gap of the expectation, what people are perceiving or experiencing, and their relative importance. And while many of these things the city does not control, it does give shows a nice snapshot of where people are feeling and thinking about some of the urgent needs in the community, including those that we provide. And then council is also engaged in strategic planning work. Staff will be coming back in July before your break to follow up and kind of continue that conversation. These really are the 4 areas of focus that have come out of that work. Many of the emergent needs that we've been providing to the community and we've been talking about at Budget Committee really fall in that urgent community needs. So there's really a thread through all of these efforts. When we think about the pieces, both our work, the survey, and your strategic planning work. And I'm going to walk through just a few of the emergent needs. And so one of the things, you'll see some numbers here. And as I thought about this work and trying to quantify how we've been investing as a city, I really thought back to the Great Recession. So as you remember, in the Great Recession, in the general fund, we reduced $30 million of general fund services. So we were really in a time of constraint. We weren't adding services. As we came out of that time, kind of into the 2011, 12 and beyond, we started making some strategic investments in our community. So we had new services and new issues emerging that we didn't have before, and we made those investments. So when you see the numbers here, I'm really thinking about what have we added that's not in our base budget as we came out of the recession. So really looking back, I just went back and looked at items that were either an adopted budget action or a supplemental budget action. And so when you see those funding to date numbers, those really are those additive numbers in addition to our current service system. So we'll start with the unhoused. As you can see from FY12 through this current fiscal year, we've funded $31.5 million. I'll talk a little bit more about what's in those numbers. Of that 31.5 million, 24.2 was one-time funding. So 4.6 million from the general fund, 1.6 million from the community safety payroll tax, and then $18 million in state and federal funding, and that includes CARES and ARPA dollars. We've also invested $1.9 million from the parks levy, and this was for park ambassadors and cleanup work in our parks. And also some ongoing dollars from the general fund are part of that, $1.4 million over that time period for downtown sanitation services, and also the ongoing ad for the homeless services policy manager. And then as we've been discussing the proposed budget, but we've included another $8.5 million to continue the current service set that's proposed in the budget. But again, as I mentioned, there is a $5 million gap for the service area in the second year of the biennium. Next, let's talk a little bit about the downtown services. So when I'm showing numbers here, this is not in relation to the downtown public safety team that's housed in EPD. That service area has been funded from the general fund and the parking fund historically. And when the community safety payroll tax was enacted per the ordinance, the funding that was previously provided by the parking fund was transferred to the community safety payroll tax fund. So these really are services that we've added outside of that core team. And so these are for things such as downtown restrooms, cleanliness, programming, security, and also the downtown manager. So this funding is all been from the general fund, mostly in one-time allocations. Two ongoing pieces have been funding for the downtown manager and the farmers market maintenance and custodial work that have been included during this time period. And so as we look to the future, the proposed budget includes continuing ongoing investments and also the repurposing strategy. So repurposing some existing services to create ongoing capacity in the service area for items also including the incident command position. And next we will look at our sustainability and climate work. So the funding that's shown here is in addition to the existing analyst that has been housed traditionally in the sustainability office. We've invested $1.1 million coming out of the recessionary period. And while an additional analyst was added on an ongoing basis through the FY22 and 23 budgets, the majority of the funding of the 1.1 really was one time, and it was mostly for things, contractual work related to planning, implementation of the CRO, and the climate roadmap. I will say for many of these, one thing I forgot to mention before is for many of these services, in addition to the pieces you see here that we've actually allocated funding for out of the budget, there are many resources that departments spend, whether it's people's time or resources out of their existing budget where they're actually supporting these areas where they don't get an additional budget appropriation for. And it can be hard to quantify those things. I think of the library and librarians working with Unhoused as an example where they don't get an additional budget allocation in their budget, but that's part of their daily work. So this work really is spread across the city for all of these types of services, but these are the places where we've actually taken budget action in addition to existing service levels to make a difference in the community. So the upcoming biennial budget for climate and sustainability is $1 million. This is primarily for 3 staff people, and we're adding a position again in the upcoming budget, and this analyst is funded through the Solid Waste Fund. So really, when we look to the future, we know that we're in a constrained time frame, and we know the pieces we know now, but there's always more things coming down the road. Our current forecast and service system does not include many of the things you see on the slides. So investments in future infrastructure, service needs. So we've talked a lot about future service needs for many of the areas, library, fire, many of the departments across the city. We know our population's growing, so we know there will be additional services that are required over time. And then also modernization. So the world is constantly changing. So we're trying to stay current with the world through technology and other things and make sure we use our resources the most efficiently as possible. And then finally, I would just also say there's always state and federal mandates that come down through the pike, and most often those are not funded. So we have those on the horizon as well. So when I think about this, I really think about it now and later. We have this short-term gap in the upcoming biennium. So we have the $8 million that's related to the structural gap, and then at least the $5 million in the unhoused. When we think about how we've funded some of these emerging needs over time, we have set service levels for our community, and we've used oftentimes general fund resources. So, but for providing those services, we would have used those dollars to support the existing service level or grow in other ways, had we not chosen to make those investments. So I really do think it's kind of a now. The now for the scope of this revenue team coming up is the biennium. As we look to the biennium, we know we have the $8 million, potentially a $5 million gap as outlined in the budget for unhoused. And then really this is the first step in a larger conversation. So the later when we think about those other things I talked about on the last slide is really looking to the future. So this revenue committee will start with the now, and then we will continue to look and understand the needs on the system in the future, and we'll have future conversations. And then that's That's what I have for you today. Really, as Sarah mentioned earlier, this really is a chance for us to hear from you, to hear what's important as we think about setting the scope for the service, the revenue team. So when I think about the scope, part of it is what services should be included, because that may impact the revenue sources that, or the paths that the committee looks at, but then also what level of service should we be providing? So what is the service set and what is the dollar amount we're trying to achieve and what makes sense for the city of Eugene as we look to the future? I don't know if the city manager has other things to add. If not, we can, we'll open up for discussion. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation, bringing in a lot of different strands of information into one. I really appreciated that summary of what we're looking at. And I see that Mike already has his hand raised. So Mike, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the presentation, Twyla. Again, forgive my voice. It's a little rough. You mentioned things that were outside of the budget numbers presented, the demands on existing services. For example, you used the library and what they do. Well, outside of that 31 point whatever it was $million that we're spending towards homeless, I'd also like to see us work hard on demand management of some of those items. For example, can anyone tell me the percentage of fire and EMS calls that are responding to emergency distress of a homeless person?
No, we won't be able to tell you right here at the table unless you know what it is. We've looked at some of that data with the alternative response, and we're actually starting to collect that data. So we'll be able to do.
I've been informed that it's a pretty high number. I hear Randy, maybe he knows.
I spoke to Chief Caven about that earlier this week, and he's estimating somewhere around 22%.
That was the same kind of information I had as well.
Their call load.
And so when we've seen their call load double over time, we could say that the increase in housing unhoused in our community has been a significant part of the increase in call load and thus the increase in demand on that budget. I don't know if anybody's comfortable saying that 22% of the fire budget could be saved if we didn't have the challenges with homelessness that we do. But you understand the larger point, I think, of maybe we could focus on demand management a little bit. The other piece was, I'm interested to hear of the work of the Revenue Committee, but I hope we approach the whole thing from the standpoint, not so much of how to increase taxes on those already paying them, but more towards how do we increase the number of taxpayers in our community. And it seems to me that the number one and number two issues to members of the community, homelessness and then housing, seem like a good place to start and a goal for starting that. It seems to me that creating as many new homeowners that pay property taxes as humanly possible, or as Alan would say it, I think, changing our inputs from the city so that the market and those who build homes suddenly feel motivated to build significantly more. We eliminate two of the largest problems in our community at the same time by creating a large number of new property tax payers at the same time that we increase our housing stock. To me, that should be our foremost goal at council at the moment, because it solves most of those problems all at the same time. Thank you.
Hey, thank you. Other comments or questions from council on this? Alan?
So the in the slides, like on slide 11, 31.5 million FY 12 through 23, that's cumulative over that entire period, right? It's not an end. So that'll be like divided by 12, be like less than $1 million a year. Okay. And can you explain the $8.3 million so a little bit clearer for me? So to me, you call that structural imbalance. So that's something that in this biennium, we don't have enough revenue to cover our expenses. And so, and I get that. So that's a short-term problem. But is that an ongoing issue, even with the recovery of the budget and with changes?
Yes, I would say it's an ongoing issue. When we look out over the forecast period, so not even just the next 2 years. So that's the amount. 8.3 is the amount we need to set the service system for the biennium and ensure we have a bare minimum amount of reserves. But when we look out towards over the forecast period, we still have we haven't solved the underlying issue where our revenues are growing at, let's say 3%, and our expenditures are growing 5 to 7%. So I would say that's where we have the now and the later. So we have the structural gap, which is the imbalance of revenue and expenditure growth, which will continue until there's other actions. So one might be property tax reform, and then or a large revenue source to address that imbalance. The other piece to that, right, is what is the size and cost of our service system? So when I look long-term, I would say, yes, it's a long-term issue.
So that's $4.15 million a year because it's a biennial number. So that means either we do changes in the way we deliver services, reductions or doing it differently, or reduce expenses or create new revenue is the way to overcome that, right?
Correct. Some combination thereof, yes.
Right. And then the $5 million for homelessness, that's the gap we've identified through the studies that we've done between what we're doing and what we need to do in order to.
So for
fund all the
unhoused,
things on the jet.
I would say for the unhoused services, a lot of our funding is one-time funding from state and federal sources. So we kind of have that fiscal cliff, right, with ARPA funds and other funding that we know of now. As we spend through that, it's one-time dollars. So I would say the 5 million really is of the service system we have, or the service delivery we have set for the biennium. That is the piece where we start to lose. We've spent through our one-time state and federal dollars, and that is the gap for that system that's set just for the FY 24 and 25 years.
So when the federal dollars go away, there's that gap.
Correct.
Keep doing what we're doing. And then for climate change, we have the $1 million, but that's entirely staff, correct? That's
primarily staff. There's a small amount of M&S, but it's very small. It's it supports their work.
Right. So there's actually $0 in our budget for climate change projects that actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions through energy efficiency or doing things differently and smarter, or buying new equipment. So we don't have any dollars going towards our actions that we need to do in order to reduce our greenhouse gas, except for those projects within the CIP, which we're doing, but have co-benefits of energy reductions or greenhouse gas emission reductions. But those aren't driven by climate change predominantly. They're driven by infrastructure needs.
I would probably disagree with that a little bit, because I think your previous policy decisions around what the city's climate goals are and our own internal climate goals have shifted a lot of our spending towards things that are actually reducing greenhouse gases. So our facility repairs, our HVAC system updates, our fleet, all of those things are climate investments. Are just not being funded through a individual bucket of here's how we're going to impact climate, because it's a core value of the organization at this point. You could say no.
I'll just build off that for a second. That
before you do that, let me clarify. So what's the driver? Would we do that? Are we doing that because it's a climate action? Are we doing that because it's in there and ancillary co-benefit is that it's a climate action? Most of the things I've seen actually are in there because we need to replace the fleet. We need to upgrade the HVAC system. We're adding that infrastructure investment because we need to do it from a CIP perspective, not from a climate change perspective. That's just, what's the driver? How many are purely just climate change projects?
Yeah, you're right. We probably don't have any or many that are purely climate change, but we have a lot of multi-objective projects. So as Sarah mentioned in the capital improvement program, you know, we are assessing and prioritizing projects. The climate recovery ordinance and our CAP 2.0 are part of the assessment, but it's, you know, part of it, right? So we also, for instance, in transportation, we have other goals around tripling walking, biking, and using transit. Those align, but they're multi-objective goals. So yeah, I would agree with that. We've done a couple things where, you know, for instance, testing electric fleet equipment where it has cost more to do that, just to kind of see proof of concept in that technology. But of course, the ultimate goal really there is we need a street sweeper, or we need this piece of equipment to do the work.
Right, or electric fire truck, which some people have. Can you bring up slide 8? So one of the things that when I was thinking about this before, when I put up the work session poll, was I was thinking, what are the needs and then the second question is there money available? So when I look at this list and I look at homelessness, not a lot of money available. When I look at public safety, we just did the CSI, so there's money available to address those issues. When I look at housing, for instance, I see that, and I know we did the CET, not sufficient in my mind, but Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but also the federal dollars.
You know what? I'm not watching the clock here.
Oh, sorry.
Way over, Alan. So why don't you take a second round for that? And let me turn it over to Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Twyla. I always appreciate the clarity and succinctness of your presentations. You just cut right to the issue, and I really love the efficiency of that. I've said this before. I think our long-term solution is economic growth. I think it's building more dense, larger buildings in our downtown core, which in turn produces more tax revenue and gives people a place to live. This is getting off the subject a little bit, but city manager, I would like to talk sometime about how we bring raising our height limit in the downtown core area. I just spoke with some developers yesterday, and they reiterated that if they could go higher, some of the projects would pencil out better. So anyway, for another, just flagging that for you. The one thing I want to get at, those are longer term fixes. And I think we need to have our eye on those as well. And then we need to figure out the short and medium term, which I think a lot of probably what we're looking at with the revenue piece, subcommittee. I do worry about additional burdens on our population. I mean, people are feeling pressed with inflation. They're feeling pressed with taxes. I know we need the money. I get that, but I hope we're just being very judicious in about what we apply new revenues to. I know there's people that are going to come into this group with a lot of energy and a lot of thought, but we need to make sure we're balancing the impact on the larger community, because we're not helping the situation if we're pushing more people towards the edge. And that whole cost of living has got to be part of the equation that we evaluate as we move forward. And so I don't really have questions at this point. I have been interested in hearing the discussion so far, but those are just some thoughts I wanted to get out. And I'm not really sure how we're going to moderate that, but I hope there's some ground rules up front for this group, that they're really thinking about cause and effect relationships, and the fact that if our longer term goal and objective is to build our economy and make a stronger economy, every dollar that costs extra to locate here, it actually serves as a disincentive as well. So just trying to keep all these various needs in somewhat of a balance, I think is going to be very difficult, but it's going to be very essential for the long-term health and welfare of our community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay, and then Jennifer.
Yeah, I think it's obvious at this point what my priority would be that we focus on for this committee for getting additional locations for our unhoused. But I guess my question is, in terms of the scope of what the committee is going to do, what is our process for seeking federal funds and grants? And would that be a part of this scope of duty for them. A little bit more just.
Right. So I would say staff are always looking at those grant type of opportunities. And the purpose for this committee really is to make a recommendation to the city manager. So understanding the services, and that certainly could be part of the recommendation, is continue to look for federal or state other funding as part of that recommendation. But they'll really take the charge from this group as to what are those services and what level, what is that dollar number, and look at any array of possible funding options to make a recommendation to the city manager. And that certainly could be part of that recommendation.
Okay. And so it feels like we're kind of got 5 minutes to complete this scope of work here. So I guess where do we go from here in terms of actually penciling out that dollar amount that we need to?
So this is actually the first of 2 work sessions. So I will be back in June, on June 21st. We really wanted to get some discussion and hear your feedback today about kind of where areas of interest lie so that we can come back in June. My hope would be that we actually set the scope for the revenue team. The time is ticking, and we would like to start work with that group, preferably in July, so that they have a recommendation back to the city manager by the end of October, so that we can bring those recommendations and have a further conversation about revenues and service priorities before your winter break.
Okay. Are we in that recruiting process right now, or can we start that now so that we can actually have a committee by July? Because it's going to take time.
It will take time, and there is a process. We'll be working with the mayor and council president. I know citizen members have already indicated interest to the budget committee chair. So we are starting to get the list, and yes, we absolutely working on that so that we can schedule meetings and hopefully in the July timeframe.
Great. I just know that the last meeting we kind of delayed it to get more information, but I wanted to get started.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a little bit of because we're doing it in this approach, it's a little bit, the first question out of people's mouth is, what are they looking to create revenues for? What's the number? And we don't have that yet. And so we're trying to do them both sort of feathered together.
Thank you.
Okay, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you for that last clarification. That's helpful. So, it sounds like you're going to bring back some more specifics maybe in the next session about kind of dialing in on what exactly we want to fund. And this is kind of today is like, are the buckets right? Is that kind of what I'm getting? Yeah. Okay. So my preference, I would have to have more information before I would be interested in downtown services. I feel like there's other ways to get that money, but maybe I'm missing something. My preference today would be unhoused and climate. So I'd be interested to get some more information about why I might be wrong and why we might want to fund, also look at downtown services in this process. For unhoused, for me, I think we've been talking a little bit about the role of the city and other parts of our government, and the concept of us as an emergency room makes a lot of sense to me, so that we stay in our lane and our partners supplement that in the ways that are appropriate to us. So that would be kind of what I would be looking for, is us sticking to the areas that are appropriate for a city to be funding, instead of there's been a little bit of, I think we've acknowledged blurring of lines in that. And so as we move forward, like just reinforcing our proper role in that, I think is important.
Okay, thank you. And if no one else needs a first round, I'll turn it back to Alan. Okay, take it away, Alan.
Thanks. 3 points real quick. When I put out the work session last year, I guess it was, it focused on homelessness and climate, because I was matching up the concerns list with available funding or lack of available funding. And to be more specific, when I looked at public safety, there was the CSI. When I looked at housing, there was the CE2, the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and federal dollars that come in through different programs. When I looked at the city infrastructure, we got federal dollars from IRA and the Bill and Ira, and the CIP is funded through that. So all three of those had access to funds. The ones that screamed out for lack of available funds were homelessness, and we had some one-time monies, but there's no ongoing funding for it, and climate change action. We have the staff, but we're not actually doing projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and save energy. So those two in particular, homelessness and climate, were the ones that were of high concern, but didn't have available funding. So that's why I focused on them. So that's my priority. I think growing our way out of this is a good thing to keep in mind, but it really helps, but it's just too slow. And the need is urgent. It's important to understand the scale and pace of that. In the budget document, she said $350 million equals $1 million in general fund. $3 million of higher assessed value creates $1 million of general fund.
Right, we were saying on average 300, 350-ish.
300 to 350, and the entire Valley River Center is how much?
To something.
About 200 million. So we need to get $5 million for that. We need basically multiple Valley River Centers within the next 2 years to come up with $5 million. And so while it helps us get there, it's not going to solve the short-term problem or even the near-term problem. It's a long-term strategy. So it's nice to focus on that, and it has all these other co-benefits, but it's not a near-term solution. But the co-benefits of all of these things that we would invest, so for instance, investing in homelessness, if we can invest in homelessness and reduce that, then we get co-benefits of reduction in fire department calls going towards that. That's a great benefit. If we invest in climate actions, we get reduced energy costs, and so and other from electricity and gasoline, for instance. So keeping in mind the co-benefits that are associated with these actions is really important, and we need to quantify those as much as possible and not just say, yes, there's co-benefits, but we need to make them real by quantifying them as much as possible.
Thank you for that. And we're at time, but I see Mike with his hand raised. So Mike will give you just another couple minutes here.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. I just wanted to add to Alan's numbers there, and I agree with them. It's a big number, and now and the immediate versus long term is a tough comparison to try and fix problems quickly. But I would just say that development, economic and residential, produces long-term ongoing revenues, solve the problem permanently, even if it doesn't happen at the speed we'd like it to. Such that, for example, the city of Beaverton set an actionable goal that they're accomplishing of seeing 500 new homes for sale constructed each year. They're half our size. We have a time in our history where we were doing 800 or 900 new homes, single family, every year, okay? Right now, we've had about 100 so far this year. If we had a similar goal to Beaverton, if we had proportionate to our size, 700 or 800 new homes being constructed each year, that's at least $1 million a year in new taxable revenues that we'd get every year. And it would, if we kept that goal up for 5 to 10 years, it would stack up on itself and solve the problem permanently. So that's why I continue to advocate for that. And it solves the other goal of making some impact on our housing market, so it's not so difficult to find housing.
Okay, thank you. I see Greg with his hand up. I see at least one counselor needs to go, but Greg, take it away for a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. Twyla, I don't know where the discussions are going as far as fees are concerned. But that's one revenue source that I've been trying to focus on in terms of how do we develop or increase fees to pay for services that we're currently getting out to the public, and then how, because the structure of fees is different than just taxes. Taxes, you can, construct taxes to pay for services, plus some other things as we move down the road in the future. But with fees, we can do those in the context of paying for services for what their costs are. So how can we look at using a different fee structure to be able to pay for some of these gaps that we currently are experiencing?
Thank you, Councilor Evans. I will say as part of this proposed biennial budget, departments actually did go through and look at they overturned every rock. And so they really did look at fees and what we're charging across the board. So I would say there's a variety of mechanisms across the organization and the different departments where departments are looking at the programs they're providing and increasing fees where appropriate for cost recovery. So, and there's a range of issues also that as people are setting fees as far as accessibility and equity and all of those things. But I would say as part of the proposed budget, staff have already taken a hard look at that and will continue to do so as we go through the biennium and look to the future.
Okay, thank you. I think with that, we'll close that up. I am hoping you got enough insight from counselors to take the next step, and we look forward to coming back to this. Thank you all for your comments. And with that, we are adjourned.